17th. Tonight on The National, more than 1 million for democracy, the largest protest in the history of modern China. General strike in Panama. It's not as big as organizers hoped. And on the Journal, a time of change in China. A communist giant experimenting with capitalism. China's elderly leaders struggle to contain a revolution of rising expectations. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. Something monumental is happening in China. The protests for democracy are getting bigger and bigger, spreading from students to office and factory workers, from city to city. More than 1 million people poured into the main square of Beijing today, the biggest protest in 40 years. Other demonstrations took place in 20 cities across China. Just a few hours ago, the Chinese premier met with some of the protesters, but not much was accomplished. And with the protest movement growing by the hour, the historic visit by the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, has been pushed very much into the background. Our Moscow correspondent, Don Murray, reports from Beijing.
This was the day when the student protests were transformed into something far greater, a mass movement of defiance, cutting across age and class and reaching across China. A vast human wave flowed through the streets of the capital, filling them, blocking them for hours. Nurses marched carrying banners saying, "I love the students." Government workers walked off their jobs and down Beijing's main boulevard, and personnel from the Bank of China left their tills for Tiananmen Square. They were all showing their support for the student hunger strikers and their goal: more democracy, more freedom, press freedom, freedom of speech for China.
I don't say I'm anti-communist or anti-government. I just demand for what I should have.
The movement has now spread to Shanghai and other major cities with the same banners, the crowds in the streets, the hunger strikers, the same demands for dialogue, for democracy. And all of it adding up to a resounding rebuff to Communist Party General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who last night issued a written appeal to the strikers in Beijing to end their protest. On this day, when power seemed to be slipping from the party and the government and shifting to the streets, these demonstrators have achieved what no one else in the past 4 years has managed. They've reduced Mikhail Gorbachev to a bit player in a far larger drama. This was not how Gorbachev had planned it. Indeed, he made a major speech this morning on the future of Sino-Soviet relations. And then he and his wife Riza traveled to the Great Wall, where, ironically, he had his only extended conversations with Chinese young people. Ever the salesman for his political ideas, he offered them this message of closer ties between the two communist giants. "We believe," he said, "that Soviet and Chinese youth will do better than we did." But the demonstrators derailed his day. A visit to the Forbidden City was canceled. And when it finally started 2 hours late, his news conference had been moved not once, but twice. Then he was asked what he would do if similar demonstrations took place outside the Kremlin. "It's not the same as comparing shoe patterns," he began. And then prudently, indirectly, he offered this advice to his Chinese hosts.
We would discuss those problems, address those problems, trying to solve them within a political process, within the spirit of democracy and glasnost, and within the spirit that we have now adopted.
That was advice the Chinese leadership hesitantly appears to be following. In Shanghai, local leaders agreed to meet a student delegation. For 4 hours, their talks were broadcast on Shanghai television. And for the first time last night, Central China Television broadcast a long, detailed report on the demonstrations, but only after its journalists threatened to walk out. And in the pre-dawn hours, student leaders on Tiananmen Square announced that the Chinese premier and other members of the Politburo met a student delegation at a city hospital at 5 a.m. But the student leaders dismissed the premier's proposals as merely rhetoric. It's a measure of the shift in the balance of political forces in China that twice now in 24 hours, the students have rejected direct pleas by the country's leaders to end their hunger strike for democratic reforms. Don Murray, CBC News, Beijing.
A protest today for democracy in Panama, but this one barely got off the ground. The opposition called for a strike to protest against General Manuel Noriega and the cancellation of the election results. But the strike had almost no effect. Noriega's government declared it illegal and most stores stayed open. Noriega himself made his first public appearance in nearly 2 weeks. He said the violence after the election was the fault of the opposition, not his troops. And he said he's waging a struggle against what he called American imperialism. Terry Malefsky reports.
A show of confidence today from General Noriega. He gave his first interview since the election and blamed the United States for the trouble in Panama.
The United States wants to stay in this country and keep its troops here. That's the cause of the problem.
Noriega's reappearance came as his police reinforced his authority on the streets of Panama City. This was the day that the opposition had called a general strike, but it did not take hold.
It is nearly noon now in central Panama City, and the street is bustling with activity. The strike has failed. However, that does not appear to be because people support Noriega. On the contrary, it's failed because the regime has threatened reprisals against any business which closed today.
We know they are open because of threats made yesterday directly with the owners of these business places.
He says that they have to open.
In a Panama City shoe store, manager Dan Levy points out the government announcement that closing up shop would be against the law. But Levy does not agree with his boss's decision to stay open.
My answer as a person, not as a manager of this store, is that we should have closed.
There were some opposition protests today, but they were smaller than they have been in the past. And in the Canal Zone, more American families were evacuated. Both the Americans and the domestic opposition had hoped that it would be Noriega who was forced to leave this country. But it is not working out that way. Noriega's grip on power now seems as firm as ever. Terry Malefsky, CBC News, Panama City.
A West German court convicted and sentenced Muhammad Ali Hamadi today for his role in a 1985 hijacking. Hamadi was given the maximum under German law, life in prison. He was one of the men who hijacked TWA Flight 847 from Athens to Beirut. The hijacking lasted 17 days, and at one point, an American sailor was shot and killed. A rare show of unity in Lebanon today. Christians and Muslims set aside their differences and joined in tribute to Sheikh Hassan Khalid. He's the moderate Muslim leader killed yesterday in a Beirut bomb attack. Thousands of people jammed the streets of Beirut for Khalid's funeral, among them both Muslim and Christian leaders. Khalid was the head of Lebanon's Sunni Muslim community. He was mourned as a man of peace, a man who had tried to negotiate an end to the 14-year civil war in Lebanon. Israel's parliament has approved Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir's plan for elections in the occupied territories. Under the proposal, Palestinians would elect representatives for peace talks with Israel. The plan has been fought, though, by some Israelis. They say it could lead to the creation of a Palestinian state. Shamir says that will never happen, and he says Palestinian activists won't even be allowed to vote. He backed up his words with some more tough action today in the territories. The roughly 40,000 Palestinians from the Gaza Strip who work in Israel weren't allowed to go to work. Here's our Middle East correspondent, Jean-Francois Lepine.
More Palestinian workers in Israel were forced back to their homes in the Gaza Strip today, following a decision by the Israeli military to seal off the area indefinitely. The measure is one of the toughest to be taken against Palestinians in 18 months of the uprising. It's part of a broader clampdown on the revolt that also involves renewed massive arrests and house searches in many areas of the occupied territories. Israelis are angered by a recent increase in attacks inside Israel. For more than a week, thousands of army troops and civilians have been searching for a missing soldier. He's the second soldier feared abducted and killed by Palestinians. The mood in Israel now threatens Prime Minister Shamir's new proposal to hold elections in the occupied territories. In Parliament today, Shamir downplayed the fears from right-wing parties that his plan would lead to the recognition of the PLO and the creation of a Palestinian state. To counter criticism from his own Likud party, Shamir promised to never give back the territories. He pledged that while extending a peace offer to the Palestinians on the one hand, he would be free to strike at the rioters.
they found some
But
point
Palestinians in the occupied territories have already rejected Shamir's peace initiative because it doesn't recognize their right to self-determination.
And we do not want to be engaged in a process that will lead us to a state of limbo. We want to be able to see light at the end of the tunnel in any process.
While Shamir defended his peace plan at home, Foreign Minister Moshe Arens was trying to counter growing skepticism about it in the United States. A visiting delegation from the State Department already warned Shamir yesterday that more needs to be added to his plan in order to attract Arab partners to the peace process. Jean-François Lépine, CBC News, Jerusalem.
Coming up on The Journal.
The rumble of Asia's restless giant. Across China, the waves of protest grow. Demands for democracy paralyze the nation's capital and disgrace its leaders. From Beijing, an eyewitness account of today's drama. In Canada, Chinese citizens follow their homeland's unrest from afar. And a documentary report on the reason for China's crisis. That's coming up on The Journal.
Ottawa can spend money again. Since early yesterday morning, the federal government said it couldn't write any checks because the Senate was holding up a money bill. The Senate was doing that to let the government know it wasn't happy with the way it spent money when Parliament wasn't sitting earlier this year. The Senate still isn't happy, but today it passed the money bill anyway. Tomorrow is payday for members of the RCMP. If the bill had not been passed, members of the force would not have been paid. The investigation of last month's federal budget leak has taken a new twist. CBC News has learned that the RCMP is looking into a second leak, one that took place the day before the leak that got all the publicity. The details from our senior parliamentary editor, Don Newman.
When Global News reporter Doug Small televised budget details the night before the budget was to be made public, it caused a sensation. But it turns out the leak to Small wasn't the only one, or even the first one. CBC News has learned that the same information contained in the budget in brief was made available to a group of people in Toronto who work for an Ontario company 36 hours before Small had it. That's 2.5 days before the budget was to be publicly unveiled. Sources won't confirm the nature of the company or the number of individuals involved. But unlike Small, the company did not report its budget knowledge immediately. In fact, it wasn't until after Michael Wilson had been forced to go public with the budget that the company told officials in Ottawa they were already aware of the details. The RCMP immediately launched an investigation. No one is commenting on the investigation, but sources tell CBC News the Toronto and Ottawa leaks may be related. All along, Michael Wilson has maintained that nothing was compromised by early knowledge of the budget.
Can he assure the House that no one has used inside information from his budget for personal gain?
Hear, hear. No evidence.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have no evidence of that at all.
When the opposition was demanding assurances that no one had profited from early information about the budget, it knew of only one budget leak. But now, with information about a second earlier leak of information in the budget, demands will intensify for assurances that no one profited. Still, the government is unlikely to make any comment until the RCMP investigation into both leaks has been completed. Don Newman, CBC News, Ottawa.
The Ontario budget is out, and people living in Canada's richest province are facing more tax increases. Corporate and business taxes are up, personal income taxes are up, and there's a new tax target: people who drive. Tom Kennedy reports.
The car would once get you away from it all. Nowadays, in Toronto, more often than not, it'll get you into this. Cars in the big city have become a polluting, congesting obstruction. They've also become the latest target for Ontario's tax collectors. There's now the tire tax, $5 each. The extra gas tax, $0.01 a litre, another cent in January. The guzzler tax. When you buy a car that burns more than 9.5 litres per 100 kilometers, it'll cost an extra $600, an extra $3,500 for more serious guzzlers. The registration tax in Toronto, $90, up from $54. Large parking lot owners have to pay an $11 a square meter tax, which means parking is going up. Today, Toronto drivers have that same post-budget feeling that smokers know so well.
alcohol and cigarettes are a choice. I suppose people have to drive.
As usual, the government's running in a deficit, so instead of cutting their spending, they're just taking it away from us.
The government is accused of gouging drivers, but it says it's just taking what it needs to maintain roads and to help clean up the environmental damage done by cars.
Ottawa are taking more in gas tax out of this province than the provincial treasury is, and they don't build a foot of road.
Smoking drivers may be a little nervous today, but oddly, tobacco was one item the budget ignored. Perhaps that's why people say that after alcohol and tobacco, Ontario's newest sin tax is the automobile. Tom Kennedy, CBC News, Toronto.
Senator Hayes and Argue will be the subject when a Senate committee gets together tomorrow in Ottawa. The committee will be studying a report on Argue's travel expenses. A private accounting firm has looked into those expenses, and according to CBC Radio News, almost half the travel claims could not be substantiated. Evidence today that Captain Joseph Hazelwood was drunk the night the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground and ripped open. It came from a U.S. Coast Guard officer who was first to arrive on the scene. He said the smell of liquor was so obvious, he recommended that Captain Hazelwood be given a blood alcohol test. And the chief mate of the Exxon Valdez told a safety board hearing of the fear that swept the crew after the tanker hit a reef and began listing.
I don't mind telling you that at that moment I knew that my world would never be the same again. I feared for my life at the time. I wondered if I'd see my wife again. And I had no idea of how bad this was, but it was the worst thing I'd ever been involved in.
Kunkel testified Hazelwood had been an excellent captain and said, in his words, it was a hell of a way to end a career. Star-kissed tuna reappeared in grocery stores today for the first time in 4 years. The store in St. Andrews, New Brunswick was the first to be restocked. Star-kissed officials did the honor themselves. 4 years ago, they were forced to close the company's plant in St. Andrews over fears that Star-kissed tuna didn't meet consumer standards. But all that's been straightened out. The company's 250 workers have been back on the job for months, and as of today, the tuna is back on the shelves. Apple growers in the United States have agreed voluntarily to stop spraying their crops with Alar, a chemical linked to cancer. They're hoping to stave off an outright government ban and hoping to reassure the public. Sales of apples have dropped drastically in the U.S. since news of the potential hazard broke earlier this year. Here in parts of Canada, sales are also way down because of the scare, but growers aren't sure what to do. Eric Sorensen reports.
Canadians aren't buying as many apples as they were a year ago. Sales at this fruit market in Toronto are down 40 to 50%.
They're scared. They're scared of watching television. They're scared seeing it all over the newspapers, and they say, hey, we don't going to buy any apples.
Even some who buy apples are worried.
First wash it, and then I peel it, and I feel safer.
What they're afraid of is Alar, a chemical that produces a bigger crop of apples by helping them ripen uniformly. Alar has also been found to cause cancer in mice. Dick Pallett has an apple orchard, 70 acres of Macintosh that are just beginning to bud. He has sprayed with Alar in the past, but doesn't know if he will this year. He says he'll probably lose money from all the publicity about Alar, whether he sprays or not.
If we decide to use it and then the consumers get their back up for one reason or another and sales drop off, you're going to suffer some substantial losses from that regard. If you don't use it, you're going to suffer yield losses on the other side.
Not all Canadian apple growers use Alar, but even in British Columbia, where Alar is not used, the largest distributor says apple sales are down 250,000 boxes a week, mainly because of the Alar scare in its U.S. market. John Brown represents apple growers across Canada, and he says Alar has been unfairly targeted.
There is no evidence to indicate that Alar is any more or any less of a problem than a range of other pesticides that are available.
The federal government believes Alar is safe.
But all of the information we have to date is that the levels of Alar on fruit and vegetables in Canada are not toxic.
Uniroyal, the company that produces Alar, says sales of the chemical are down substantially. Uniroyal is also conducting tests for the federal government to determine whether Alar poses a health risk. A spokesman for Health and Welfare says whether Alar will be banned depends on the outcome of those tests. The results aren't expected until next year. Eric Sorensen, CBC News, Toronto.
There's there's a measles epidemic in Quebec, and it could mean some children won't be allowed to go to school for a while. Most children are vaccinated against measles, but a lot of children in Quebec are not. And as Paul Workman tells us, they're the ones who may be missing some school.
The measles epidemic has spread in spite of extraordinary measures to control it. There was a mass vaccination during the winter. In the last 2 months, more than 23,000 Quebecers have been given their shots. Still, the disease is spreading quickly.
In Quebec as a whole, we're up to 2,000 cases that we know about.
Health officials now say it's such a serious outbreak, anybody who's not vaccinated may be kept out of school.
In the area of Greater Montreal, that there are still about 20,000 students who have not been able to show a proof of vaccination and who should be vaccinated.
It's a nasty disease. At least 15 Quebec children have been taken to hospital. Coughing, nausea, high fever, congestion, those are symptoms. 1 in 1,000 cases leads to brain-damaging encephalitis. Still, some families would rather take